All right. Hello, everybody. We're live. Welcome back to Creation Myths. Tonight, I am so excited. I've been looking forward to this one for a while. My guest tonight is Dr. Joel Duff. He is a professor at the University of Akron. He has a PhD from the University of Tennessee in botany, specializing in molecular systematics. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
All right, cool. And oh, good. And I can hear me coming through on YouTube. Great. So if at any point you can't hear me, just let me know in the chat and I'll see it and I'll see if I can fix things. But it seems like everything is working fine, but live TV stuff happens. So, Dr. Duff, thank you so much for being here. We've been chatting for a while on and off. Just our paths have crossed when it comes to dealing with young Earth creationists, most recently on YouTube. So, tell everybody a little bit about yourself and then we'll get right into this. We have so much to talk about. We have so many fun things
Yeah.
to talk about.
Who knows where this is going to go? Yeah, but thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. Yeah, who am I? I'm a hodgepodge of a variety of things, right? Various histories that have come together to make, the thing that's before you today. And I guess I'm sure what you're going to ask me is like, well, how in the world did I get to this point of like knowing a bunch about creation science? Am I a creation scientist or was I? No, I've never been a young Earth creationist per se, but I have a history and a background in churches. My father is a pastor, and growing up, I grew up in Western Colorado, and at the very edge of Western Colorado near Utah. So our background, our backyard was fossils, and we were right next to Utah, and we climbed mountains and we did all that stuff. And my father really appreciated nature and we'll say the creation around us. And he's a pastor of a conservative Presbyterian church, and I am still a member of a conservative denomination myself as a believer. And so, like, where did I run into young Earth creationism? Because in the 1970s, it was a thing, um, and but it wasn't really a thing for us necessarily. I just remember looking at fossils, thinking about fossils, and eventually I went to college at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and that's a conservative Christian college. And I started out as a physics major. I wanted to be a particle physicist. I was either going to smash atoms and look at tiny things, or to be an astronomer, right? Just big picture, or get right down to the the tiniest elements, right? The big questions, kind of thing. But turns out I'm not a mathematician, so physics is not really going to work. So I ended up being a biologist there, even though I kind of wanted to be a geologist, but they didn't have much of a geology program at the time. So that sort of funneled me into another science. But I wasn't really challenged there in terms of young Earth creationism. We kind of just generally didn't talk about that issue very much. And it wasn't until I went to graduate school. I went to the University of Tennessee, and I am attending what is called a Bible Presbyterian church, and clearly most people there were young Earth creationists. And then I am at the University of Tennessee, and I'm doing molecular systematics, which is I'm looking at relationships of organisms and thinking about all these types of topics. And like both worlds are like asking me, like, how do you go to that church over there? Like, what is that about? And how do you reconcile that with the types of things you're learning and doing now? And then I'm going to church and I'm spending time with people there, and they're like, how can you work at a secular university, and how what are you learning there, and you're a biologist, and that must be really tough on you. And so it's like there's no comfortable spot to be in. And that's when I was introduced to Whitcomb and Morris's The Genesis Flood, which is sort of the Bible of young Earth creationism, at least modern young Earth creationism. And I was handed a copy actually at after church by a concerned person who's like, you're probably hearing these things, but you really should read this book because I think it'll provide a lot of answers. A lot of things is going to really help you understand this world that you're entering, and strengthen your faith and be able to propel you forward and be able to ward off these influences.
Right.
And I certainly knew about the book, and I certainly knew about Young Earth Creationism, but I opened the book and started reading, and it's like, really, I can't. It just, it didn't jive, obviously, with my own personal experience, having grown up with fossils and really delving into and looking at and understanding fossils. And so that was a pretty shocking experience. And you could say that that was the day that I was like, I need to know more about this, because I need to be able to talk about it. And I also personally, I realized that I had kind of like cognitively not allowed myself to really delve into the topic very much.
Mhm.
Like, it's just easier just kind of like, I don't think about those topics. And
Just
but
easier to say, okay, I do this professionally. I do this
yeah,
over here on my other time, and we're just not gonna.
yeah, and to kind of shrug off the hard questions. Realized, no, I'm gonna always be dealing with this. And then I started to dig into Young Earth Creationism, and at that time, that was Institute for Creation Research is kind of getting started. We're now in the 90s, so it's the origins of Answers in Genesis, and the major creationist ministries are really starting to gain some traction and having more influence in the church. So prior to that, there wouldn't have been like the homeschooling movement. There wasn't a bunch of
Mhm.
literature in a bunch of different churches that were Young Earth Creation. You had to be kind of like interested in that topic and then
You
seek
had to
that
go
out.
out and find it,
Right. Instead of it
and
just
now
kind of like,
it's
shoom,
finding you.
it's just part of the core of like what's
Mhm.
going to be there. And you're going to know it, sort of cradle to grave, in some circumstances. So it's, I, I'm aware of those things, and this is the beginning of the internet in the late mid 90s, right? And you first start seeing these, I can get more access to like what creationists are saying. And I just was partly I was fascinated, but partly I'm also answering questions for myself, right? I,
Mhm.
I'm I'm curious. I'm willing to give a hypothesis a try, right? As a scientist, you're saying, okay, give me your best arguments, give me your best evidence. Let me see how that fits. And for me, I'm interested also from a theological standpoint. I need to have answers from if the world is old, right? If the world is ancient, then I have to have theological rationales for how the Bible should be interpreted, or can it be? I have to ask myself, can it be interpreted in such a way that I can faithfully believe in this text and these things, and at the same time find room, right, for this scientific evidence? And that's a long time. That's like 10 years. That's like all through graduate school of really working on both of those issues at the same time.
Mhm.
you know and really being challenged by, and it's really helpful to be challenged, right? It's helpful to have people ask questions and develop relationships where you can have real conversations, not internet Twitter wars over something, but sitting down and actually discussing something. uh, Got involved. I did eventually get involved in sort of some initial, you remember email lists? I don't know if you're
Oh,
probably
I
much younger
remember.
than I am, but I was on email list of
I
pastors who
remember
discuss
email.
these
I
topics.
remember email lists. Look, I am, just so everyone knows. Look, I am a veteran of the early aughts intelligent design blog wars. Okay, like I was there for that. So just, I'm,
Okay.
you know, I know what's going on a little bit.
For me, I'm seeing a lot of different things in those email lists, because my father's a pastor and I am within that denomination. I'm fairly well known because we traveled all over and I met lots of other pastors, and they know me. Um, I was able to be on some of these lists that are like elders and pastors in the church, and they have discussions and they ask me questions, and I got into I spent enormous amounts of time just answering questions, and being up at 3 a.m. and being upset about, you know, what somebody said, and then I'm typing out a response. A lot of sleepless nights in as a postdoc, actually. Um, Not because I had great research and I was so excited, but I actually had great research and was really exciting and got to publish and got a job out of it. But I also, didn't get any sleep.
Other
Just
stuff was the problem.
in
Yeah.
other words, this was still a side interest even then, and that was 1996 through 1999, and so that's now 20 some years. of having an
So
intense interest in this topic.
I actually forgot to mention at the top that you have a YouTube channel, which is linked in the description, everybody. You should go down and subscribe right now. If you're subscribed to me and not to Dr. Duff, I don't know what you're doing, but you should do that. And also the blog is also linked down there. And I want to make sure everyone checks it out, because what Dr. Duff does now is this wonderful, just ongoing narration of just what's happening in creationism. There's the This Week in Creationism series. We just got the This Year in Creationism, which was great, and I recommend that series to everybody. It's wonderful. How did you go from like kind of grappling with the theological and the scientific kind of questions yourself and being involved in these conversations to like the person who just documents the history in real time? How did that happen?
Well, that's just a natural outcome of having spent so much time in the literature, and essentially going to Young Earth Creationist websites every day, or not every day necessarily, but at least once a week, and seeing what's being said. And because usually I'm being asked some question by somebody and it relates to something that's out there right now. And once you've looked at that enough for enough years, you just kind of it's the gestalt of the whole thing, right? You just kind of get a feel for the vibe among different creationists in different areas. I also know some creationists as well personally, and have interactions with them privately, and because I'm in that world too. I mean, I have Young Earth Creationists around me, fairly close to me personally, and then within the church, and I have sit down discussions with them and talks with them. And as much as it may be hard to believe because people just see the internet interaction often, I have very cordial relationships with many devout Young Earth Creationists. And that's I've changed a
that's very
lot of
easy
Young
to
Earth
believe.
Creationist minds in terms of just their approach to it and understanding through that.
So here we are. It's 2022 now, and it's been, so for me, like in my life, I got into this 90s as kind of the intelligent design movement was ramping up, and then kind of culminated with the Dover trial, which was a little bit anticlimactic for that movement, I feel like, if you were a proponent of that movement. And then I kind of stopped paying attention for a few years, but got back into it a bunch of, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago at this point. And the landscape has really changed since like 2006, 2007. If you go to like just from then to like 2015, 2016, the landscape really changed. I remember having having an argument. We'll call it a debate, but it was probably more like an argument on Reddit, of all places. And something was off about it, because I was expecting intelligent design, because the last time I'd really paid attention was like 2006 or so, right? And something was off about it. I just stopped. I said, just hang on a second. How old is the Earth? And the person I was talking to was like, well, I don't have a strong opinion on it, but it's 6,000 year old. I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
When did that happen again?
Not 10, 6.
Right, specifically 6, not 10. And that was eye-opening for me, because for the better part of that decade where I was really paying close attention, it was kind of fashionable, at least in the ID circles, to like, yeah, but we don't talk about those young earthers, right? We don't talk about them. Like, they're there. Like, yeah, I mean, Ken Ham is fine, but like, we don't really talk about them. We're the scientists, right? So, it's Dr. Behe and Dr. Dembski, and Dr. Ross and Dr. Rana, the old Earth creationists, but like, we are now legitimate scientists. And then I vanish, and then I come back, and all of a sudden the young earthers are in charge again, and I was very confused. So could you, just for everybody here, just kind of give us the lay of the land? Like, who are the big organizations? Who are the big players right now? And, we could spend hours on each organization, I'm sure, but just briefly, like, kind of how did we get to where we are now, where all of a sudden the young earth organizations are ascending again?
Well, let me start with, that's an interesting observation you make about your own observations of the world around you. And I think, partly that may be you're a science educator and you're interested in science, and you see that this was a very Discovery Institute and all these different things, intelligent design was very much an approach to try to get
Like,
this intelligent design thing into schools, and to say this is
right.
a legitimate scientific approach to understanding the world around us, and and explicitly bring a form of theism into an academic environment, right?
Right.
And so you would
I'm a
have
lot
experienced
less
that and
polite
seen
than
that
that.
more.
Yeah. I'm a
Yeah,
lot less
well,
polite than that. I mean, the ID movement was a fraudulent PR campaign to get creationism into public schools. Like, I'm a lot less polite than you when it comes to that. Like, that's what it was. It
yeah,
was like, we're going to take the same words, but we're going to change the name,
yeah.
and then it's going to be legal. And like, oh.
But at the end of the day, they have to have a reason why they would want it in schools, right? I
Mhm.
mean,
Yeah.
it's got to be there for a reason, because they have some belief that
Yeah.
this is a worldview system that's important to know, and allow people to have the opportunity to make a choice
Right.
among. And of course, that movement. Okay, so your question is a really great one, because it's, well, where did this young Earth create? What tipped the scales? Like, why is young Earth creation now the thing you hear about more? I'm going to say that young Earth creation was quite strong even in the 1990s. Um, Even though I was only just getting into it, I knew of it in churches. But the thing is, it was sort of within the church. It was not a movement that was like reaching out and trying to make a big splash in terms of culture wars, and saying we want to do anything more than protect our understanding of Genesis theologically in the church, and we're going to provide our people with some scientific evidence to help them, comfort them that this view is actually, that the Bible is right when it says that it was 6 days. And so we're going to give you the tools to be able to say, okay, yes, I can be comforted there. They're not reaching out any. In other words, their influence hadn't gone out beyond that. And really, that
That's
influence was sort of
right.
in the fundamentalistic churches, Baptist churches and so forth. I mean, you have the Southern Seventh Day Adventist, which is the longer history of young Earth creation, and kind of coming out of that.
Right.
I I, I think it would have I think it would have happened anyway without the Seventh Day
Mhm.
Adventists, but nonetheless,
It's
there are
kind of like a
ties there.
kind of a side branch. I think they have a common
Yeah,
ancestor in
it
terms of
it
the young
met
Earth.
it met fundamentalism, and then kind of exploded from there, because it was really the fertile ground for it, versus
Right.
the Seventh Day Adventist.
Mhm.
And so it's percolating kind of within the church, and then you have the homeschool movement kind of growing in the late 80s, mid 90s. And then so they're then developing literature for homeschoolers, because they've already abandoned the idea, right, of we're going to get this into public schools. It
Right.
was, ICR did have that dream, and they had their own ICR's Institute for Creation Research, which was out in California, and that was Henry Morris's organization. So after the Genesis
Henry
flood,
Morris, who
who is
Genesis
the
Flood. Right.
he's the father of modern young Earth creationism. He's the one that brought it to greater attention than it would have been in the Seventh Day Adventist church. So let's call him, he's the popularizer within the church. His organization ICR, they do have some nascent ideas of, like, we can make this into a science, right? Because they called it creation science, and they emphasized the scientific aspect of that.
Right.
We're going to find proofs that are like convincing to other scientists, convincing to other people. We're going to use the scientific method to provide that data. I don't think that's kind of a dream lost. I think now it's more insular. It's now just providing enough evidence to convince those that are already within the group that you should stay, right?
That's Yeah, I just want to say that's exactly my like, as a scientist, like, my specialty is genetics and evolution. And as someone with that specialty, when I read stuff from ICR or Answers in Genesis or any of it, I am not the target audience. They
Oh,
are
no, no.
not trying to convince me at all. They're not even trying. I might as well not exist. It's
Yeah.
They're all, like you said, it's the people that are already kind of in the club and just strengthening that.
Which is
It's
why
not
there's a whole
meant.
set of keywords, and it's not secret language, but it is coded language that you understand that triggers certain people to say, oh, you're saying the things I expect you to say. And that's where you get different definitions for terms and words, which is which makes it difficult to even explain creationism to some other people, because some of those words have the appearance, right, of saying something, like trying to explain natural selection, but you really mean something else sometimes. So yes, that's I think Young Earth Creationism has kind of sort of circled the wagons more so in recent years. But the reason you see it more now is because Ken Ham kind of rises out of, he's from Australia originally. He's a high school teacher in the 80s. He's only I think 30 when he comes to the United States. He has a desire not to do science. He has a desire to be an apologist, right? To promote the Christian faith. And this is a tool, using creation science as a tool, because it kind of gets at what he thinks is a central issue, which is it's the whole authority of the scripture thing. If one piece falls, then it all falls. So you need to protect this piece of this interpretation that the world must be young. And if you can convince people of that, and you have any support of that, then everything else kind of flows from that. And so, but he becomes a very popular speaker for Institute for Creation Research. But he's never been interested in the research side of it, or the creation science part. I think he sees that it's not really, the only thing it's useful for is just a tool to sort of to ask interesting questions, because people have questions like one of their top searches on their site last year was, who was Cain's wife? And that's not a scientific question. And then other questions are like about dinosaurs, or people just have natural questions, I guess you could say.
Right. You
and
read the
as
stories.
long as you have the answers to those questions, then that's just a jumping off point to talk about the things you want to talk about, which is you have the authority of scripture, and now I want to then use that as a platform for all the other issues I want to talk about.
Tell me if this makes sense to you, because this is kind of the way I think of like the Ken Ham approach, which is like you kind of need to meet like a threshold of plausibility. And to the extent that he's interested in science, or organizations like AIG are interested in the science side of it, it's to get them to that threshold of plausibility. If you can make it look like we have answers to these questions that people come up with, there's science that explains whatever it is. How did the human population get so big so fast? Well, we have math for that, right? And it just crosses that plausibility threshold.
And we have this volume, Answers book number 4, and on page 53 there's your answer.
There you go.
And it's gonna and they'll suggest we have this operation, right? We have this organization of scientists who are undergirding those answers, which are very simple. And so you can just trust that those answers are going to be that's going to be enough. Don't dig any further, because you wouldn't want to dig any further on some of those. We find out they're not actually well supported. But
So going back a little bit, so that's Ken Ham. He's with ICR, Institute for Creation Research, but he leaves them. And
in I got it over here, 1994. So only 7 years later, he develops a really popular series called Back to Genesis, and that's his speaking sort of series that he develops for ICR. And that becomes a really hot video that's like shown in Sunday schools, and it's a big seller for ICR. But I think he realizes that, he's not going to ever be in charge at ICR, because that's Henry Morris and Morris's son, and there's a lineage there, right?
Right. There's already a big name. I mean,
they're the
lineage that's ready to go.
They're the 10,000-pound gorilla.
You're never going to displace a Henry Morris at the head of a creation organization. No. It's never going to happen.
So he packs his bags, goes to Kentucky, and for a variety of reasons, but it's centrally located, cheap land, and there's a lot of economic reasons and so forth. So he ends up there, and then he starts something called Creation Science Ministries, but soon he changes the name to Answers in Genesis, because it really does fit this broader thing that he's interested in, which is all of your answers, right, to life's questions that can be derived from scriptures, all emanate from a proper understanding of Genesis. And so all we have to do is get you to the proper understanding of Genesis. Once you understand that, everything else kind of just falls out from there, and we can lead you to the right answers in other areas as well.
So that's now mid 90s ish. We have AIG.
Yeah.
Which is so funny because in my conception, AIG is just one of those. They've been there for, this is one of the old boys that have been there forever, but they're actually relatively recent. And then
really not until 1999, 2000 did they have a fairly large footprint, an actual website.
That's so funny.
They're doing a lot of speaking, sending out newsletters. And that's another reason you wouldn't necessarily have heard about it as much, is because they're working on that direct route rather than this web route.
And at that time in the mid to late 90s now, the people doing the outreach outside of the, already in the club, it was really the intelligent design people at that point were really trying to get their foot in every door they could open. And my impression is that the Young Earth people were just kind of not doing that at that point. They were not doing that type of outreach. You weren't going to hear about
they were influenced by ICR, which was, we're going to win people over through our science, but they also knew that they were very much in conflict with Discovery Institute and these other things, because they weren't, for one thing, they weren't explicitly Christian, and that was a big problem, because they had people in that fold that were
the DI that is not explicitly Christian.
I'm sorry. Yeah, right. And so that was something they were a little queasy being associated with. It's like, fine, they're anti-evolution, but they have old Earth advocates there, and Behe is kind of like, he's espousing. Well, it turns out Behe espouses a lot of evolution that they now accept, but at the time they didn't.
I find Behe so fascinating because if you take this is a tangent, but it's interesting, and it kind of goes at what I really
tangent away
want to get to. It's you take Michael Behe, right, and you take like Ken Miller, and you take Francis Collins, right?
Yeah.
And even somebody like Seigart, for example, right? And these are all to varying degree, right? These are all believers to whatever degree they identify, right? Some of them very famously so, but Behe very strongly identifies with intelligent design and kind of more broadly on the creation side of things. Whereas like Ken Miller very famously is constantly going toe to toe with Behe, right? On this question, even though famously a devout Catholic, kind of coming down completely on the other side of this publicly. But if you were to compare the two of them in terms of universal common descent and the role of a creator, the Judeo-Christian God in both cases in an ongoing basis, they're actually not that different. And like, would the term theistic evolution apply to both? It really kind of comes down to like how you publicly identify, whereas the underlying beliefs are really similar there, and it's hard to draw where that line is.
Well, you're saying fundamental beliefs, but you're really talking about a checklist of like all these scientific principles and ways of defining it. Yes, you can check all these off. So in terms of a scientific worldview, in terms of our understanding of the operation of science and natural things, they would be checking the boxes off very similarly. Right. The problem is they have underlying theological variations. I'll put it that way, in terms of their interpretation of Scripture and their understanding of how God actually interacts with the world, and that, I think, that draws them apart.
Yeah.
And so their science isn't really that far off, and so sometimes it looks like, well, why can't they agree? Well, it's kind of like getting a Presbyterian and a Baptist to agree and somebody else on something. Fundamentally, you'd look at them from the outside and say, aren't they all kind of the same? But they have some significant differences interpretively in terms of how to understand, well, what I call hermeneutic principles, how you go about interpreting text.
So that aside, back on track. So now we have AIG. Now AIG is kind of spanning the globe. They end up expanding all over the place, and then they have a subsequent split that results in CMI, Creation Ministries International. And man, if anyone hasn't looked into that, you should read up on that split, because that was a doozy. there was some bad blood between those two organizations, and I don't know if there still is,
Yeah,
but that was
that's
quite a thing.
it still persists. I mean, it's there. I would say more so on the CMI side in terms of their interactions with Answers in Genesis. I think that they are, well, once again, I think if you took those two organizations and said, what is their position on a whole bunch of different like answers for the way they approach creation science, they're very, very similar. But they do have some different approaches in terms of how they, well, I'll say how they do their apologetics. How do they sell their material sometimes is a little bit different between the two. And they don't have this one top figure, which is sort of running the whole show, which gives them a different flavor too. But CMI is kind of the original Answers in Genesis from Australia, because that's where it all started. I mean, Ken Ham had friends in Australia still after he came here. And when he started Answers in Genesis, it was Answers in Genesis USA and Australia together. The split really is between the Australians and the Americans, what are now the Americans. And CMI comes out of that. And they have something of an international flair too, even today, but they're not nearly as widespread as Answers in Genesis, who now is in Latin America. They have a Canadian office. They're in Britain.
Everywhere.
Yeah, they've translated into multiple languages. I was down in Guatemala a couple years ago. I went to do I talked about creation science at a seminary in Guatemala, and they invited me down there along with a couple other people to talk about sort of scientific questions and answer questions for people who don't get to really interface with these types of things, and people like myself. And what was interesting is they took me to the library, and I remember this very clearly. The man who took me to the library showed me in the library a whole section of creation science books. They were all from Answers in Genesis, and they were all translated into Spanish on the shelf. And that was a huge donation, right? That Answers in Genesis gave to the seminary. And he said, we have people who like want answers for, what about the flood and the fossils and, your typical questions that people are asking. And well, here you go. Here's all the answers, right? The answer book is right there in Spanish for you.
Called,
and he
like,
recognized
the answer book
that
volume, whatever.
Yeah, and he, there was like, this is a problem. He recognized that this isn't the only thing that we need to be teaching our seminary students. They need to see other viewpoints. And even he thought it was Answers in Genesis wrong, but they're so influential even down there that that's what your outlying congregate, your person out there, they've heard this Answers in Genesis stuff and they've never heard anything else. So a pastor who's being trained has to be really, they have to know a lot and be able to navigate a really difficult a difficult situation. And so I was there to try to help talk about this topic and get them to think about it in other ways. But that was a really vivid memory for me to see that. And it was like, he pointed that and he said, this is why you're here. It's like, look, we need to hear some other voice and talk about this from a Christian, somebody who is taking this seriously, both theologically, but also knows their science.
And that's a really great illustration of this kind of, I don't want to call it the new AIG, but the reorientation of being very outward facing from AIG, where a lot of outreach, so this international outreach. And of course, in the US, very famously, we have the Creation Museum and now the Ark Park, right? These just like literal monuments to creation where you can go and see a life-size, ark. And I want to direct everybody again to Dr. I never get the directions right when we're sitting here, to Dr. Duff's channel. Because he just did kind of a 5-year review of the Ark Park now that it's been open and operating for a while. And I think everyone should check that out to just get kind of a feel for what they're doing and what they're trying to accomplish and kind of how it's going. And that's I think very emblematic of AIG, kind of their orientation right now of, we have the resources, we have the footprint, we have the, we're trying to break it. We're trying to be known outside of the circle that like you came up in when you were in grad school, right? It's want to bust
Yeah.
out of that and be just like a thing that people know of. Oh yeah, the Ark Park down in Kentucky, that's a thing. Even if they've never heard of Ken Ham or
Right.
AIG, you know what the Ark Park is, because like that is a thing that people hear about. And like that's kind of, it feels to me like that's kind of the goal, to just be like part of, like, I don't know how else to put it, be like just part of society that people know about.
It's a really amazing grassroots strategy, where what you do is well, it goes along with all the materials for like homeschooling and so forth, right? You get this material into the hands of the average person in a church, not the leaders. Now, of course, they have leaders conferences and all that, but the real strength of the movement is you get people at the bottom, right, who then expect to hear more of this, and then they demand to hear that from their pastor. What does Ken Ham always do? He tells them, you ask your pastor these 3 questions. If they don't give you the right answer, then boot them out, right? That's powerful. I know that because I'm a preacher's son and I know a lot of preachers, and it's a very difficult position to be in when maybe you have gone to seminary, and remember they call them cemeteries because they warn their audience that you're going to be fed untruths there. So but they've actually maybe understand the Hebrew language and they understand cultural context. They have learned a lot of tools, but it's very hard to then reach your audience, right? Your congregation, when they've all grown up with this expectation and have heard that any other thing is compromise. And that then makes pastors reluctant because their jobs depend on it. I mean, there's, many are bold, but it is hard. It is really hard in that environment to be outspoken on the topic. And so that's Ken Ham is great at this, right? He calls people out all the time. He calls people out and says, this person is saying this, and he has so much cultural influence now that you'll see people either back away or they have to double down, and then rifts are created, and that's creating rifts in the church. And so that's, you asked earlier, like, why spend so much time and how did I get involved and why do I stay up till 3 a.m.? For me, it's not, I'm upset about the science and how crappy the science is. That wrangles me as a scientist, right?
Right.
But I don't think I could expend this much energy if it weren't that I cared about the misuse of and creating strife and division within the church. That to me is like the passion, right? Because I see it as hugely damaging. And so that's why that gives me the energy, to care. I'm in a position where I know something about science and I've grown up in that world, both as around Young Earth Creationists, but also as a scientist. I have a unique perspective to be able to share with people.
So I want, just so everyone's like clear about this, Dr. Duff is not exaggerating at all with that description of like how Ken Ham talks about these issues. I read a book last year. I don't think it came out last year, but it's relatively recent. It was a book called Already Gone. And it was about the crisis of kind of adolescents and young adults leaving the church as defined by Ken Ham. And he talks about all the stuff that you just mentioned, stuff like if your pastor says X, Y, and Z, then he's a compromiser and you need to replace your pastor because they're just setting them up for failure once they go to college. Don't send your kids to college if they haven't if they haven't learned X, Y, and Z, or, whatever things that are going to allow them to kind of protect themselves from the propaganda. Like it is exactly as, the word that comes to mind for me when I read it is exactly as paranoid as like you would think would be a parody, but it is actually exactly like that. And it's extremely aggressive towards like supposed like not saying exactly the right thing and setting people up to be susceptible to the secular propaganda when they go to college or something, right? It's very much in that realm. So I want to go. So we have in the current world now, we've kind of, there's in the the parlance of the discussion, you've got the big three. You've got ICR, Institute for Creation Research, you've got Answers in Genesis, and you've got CMI, Creation Ministries International. I always add Discovery Institute for that because they're small, but they got a lot of money behind them, and they tend to punch above their weight in terms of publicity. And all these organizations broadly agree that evolution is bad, evolutionists are lying, and Darwinists are meanies for keeping us out of school, and also Darwin was a meanie and a racist, which is true. He was progressive first time, but he was still a giant racist. But that's about where the agreement ends between these organizations, and that's where reading a lot of the different things and watching the weekly This Week in Creationism series is really eye-opening, because you see like exactly where these fault lines are between these major organizations. So what are some of the big questions that are unanswered where they do not agree with each other?
Well, there's a lot of questions unanswered, and I'll frame this in, because Answers in Genesis is the 10,000 pound gorilla in the environment now, not ICR. The average person, the average Christian who is seeing material from Creationist and getting material, their perception probably is of great uniformity. This all sounds the same, because it is all written by mostly one organization, and they're pretty good at being internally consistent in terms of their message. But and I don't think most people are sophisticated enough to really read the literature of ICR and then compare it to Answers in Genesis. So they don't really see that there are significant differences that are actually scientific. All right, so let's begin here. ICR is traveling a somewhat different path. They still are very dedicated to doing what they call creation science and doing as much research as they can. And you can debate what research means, but they have PhDs there that are thinking through topics, and they're trying to explore what they think are the hard topics in creationism. And the hard things right now are this flood thing, right? You've got a global flood that is responsible for laying down all the sedimentary material that has all the fossils. Well, I just said all, but that's not true, right? There was probably some sediment before the flood. There was probably some sediment laid down after the flood, during the time after the flood. So that raises the question, where's the line?
Where is it?
Right. Noah landed on the Ararat Mountains, got off the ark, and walked out into a world, right? And that world was some world where the water is draining off of it, and it has a boundary, right? There's an upper layer to sediment, but then erosion's taking place. Animals are living on that land. They're going to get buried under that, in local floods later on and other catastrophes. And so there is a portion of the fossil record that must be post-flood. If you ask somebody from ICR, where is that boundary? Like, where would you find the line between, hey, if you just looked at this fossil, was that made by the flood? Or was that an organism that lived after the flood and came to its demise sometime more recently? And you ask that to an Answers in Genesis person, you're going to get very different answers.
Yeah.
And those answers are critical, because they represent large differences in understanding of the fossil record itself. I mean, if a bunch of fossils were formed after the flood, then all of them had to have been descendant of, we're talking animals that came on the ark. So,
right.
And I want to remind your audience that not every species had to be on the ark. We're talking about vertebrate land animals. But any vertebrate land animal that's in the fossil record, if it's post-flood, that means it must have been derived from a descendant that got off the ark. And so if there are a lot of post-flood animals, which Answers in Genesis believes there is a tremendous number of post-flood fossils.
It's a
for example,
lot of speciation.
All of the carnivores, all are present in the post-flood world. So that means somewhere, somehow, they got fossilized later. So there must be a massive events occurring. That parenthetically, that also means that fossilization can occur without a global flood. But ICR would put the flood boundary much later. that then influences their understanding of how much diversity can evolve and change after the flood. It was either a small amount because there's not much change in the fossil record, or you have to hypothesize an absolutely enormous amount because the animals had to have changed a lot, and you can see it in the fossil record. Like they'll admit, like there's the fossil record, and there's sort of like almost a transitional line going from the original carnivores to different species of carnivores. So yes, transitional fossils exist.
It just
so you
happened,
see how that's a big difference.
And it just happened starting like 4,000-ish years ago, right? Would have been around the flood boundary, and then within very short amount of time. So
and
I
that
think
brings out the other major issue, right? The speed and rate at which organisms can change. Because now most creation organizations agree that change happens.
Yeah.
The question is how much change can happen
and how fast.
And they're really in a significant disagreement about those things. And you would think that this is something that actually should be relatively clear, if it were true, right? If this were the real history of the world, I think it would be discoverable, and yet it's not evident.
There have been attempts. So for example, there was the famous, in some circles, the mitochondrial DNA barcoding paper from a few years back now, where the creationist organizations so the finding of the paper was that in the last 100 to 200,000 years, somewhere in that range, every extant animal species, terrestrial vertebrate species that they surveyed, had a bottleneck somewhere in that time frame. And what like the creationist organizations did is they took that and said, look, they all originated recently. It's like, no. Okay, first of all, bottleneck is not the origin. But second of all, the range they gave was spanning 150,000 years, right? So that's not going to help you.
But it's not billions. So that's kind of like their age. That's like their evidence for the age of the young Earth. It's like, it's not a billion. It may be a million, but it's not a billion. So therefore our hypothesis.
So therefore so it can be 6,000, right? The other problem though is I love this post-arc speciation problem, because there's no easy answer no matter which way you fall on it. So if you take the I believe it's the AIG route, which is in favor of a lot of speciation afterwards. I think it's Nathaniel Jeanson, and I think it was with Jason Lyle. He wrote up a thing a few years back, and he basically hypothesized, you mentioned the carnivora, where I think he hypothesized like 7 or 8 like arc kinds, and then tons of speciation. So all the extant Felidae, Canidae, Ursidae, like all of them from individual pairs of organisms within the last 4,000 years, right? And then, so you have to compress a ton of speciation, not into 4,000 years, but you really only have until like Middle Kingdom Egypt, when all the extant things start showing up in hieroglyphics. Because at that point, like all the extant felids existed by Middle Kingdom Egypt, because we have pictures of them that people made. So it's like you don't have 4,000 or even 2,000 years. You have like a few hundred years to get there.
The Bible mentions foxes, dogs, and wolves. Fairly early on.
So the other side of it is, okay, well, let's say the geological column is, mostly flood. Okay, great. Now you don't have to pack all that evolution into just a few centuries, but now you have to fit an exponentially higher number of species on the arc. And that has with it its own problems, plus the biogeography of now things that are really close to things that exist today.
Yeah, it looks like there's a lineage going through the flood, but not through the arc. Yes.
And they started in one specific place on Earth. They had to have, once the floodwaters receded, and now they have this very specific biogeographical pattern that does not reflect the radiation from that central point, right? So you can go the other way and have a late flood boundary, but that creates as many problems, because you solve the speciation problem, but now you have introduced a whole other set of issues that...
So I think once creationist organizations, they used to be really solely focused on the age of the Earth. Right, the radiometric dating, and so they were so focused on that. It was kind of like, oh, evolution's like, yes, we're anti-evolution, because it was sort of like, if we can convince you the world is young,
then that's it.
Don't worry about anything else, because it all falls apart anyway. But it's sort of like it's kind of a curse of like, once you've answered some questions and you need something to do, and you get asked more questions and you start getting into more details. Now it's like, oh, now we need to explain
Mhm.
exactly what were the things on the ark? How did they become the way they are? And the farther they go into that, the more they end up, because honestly, I read one article about this is the way it must have happened, and this is why it couldn't happen that way. And I think they're absolutely right. It couldn't have happened that way. Your
It could
arguments
not do that.
against this, they're excellent, they're rational, but the other side has completely rational reasons why they must be wrong too. Um,
Right.
I say like that means both sides are probably wrong because you both
Right.
can find critical faults in the other.
Exactly. That's
Um,
exactly my perspective on this. When it comes to speciation rates, when it comes to the flood boundary, the criticisms leveled against each other. Like, I don't have to read geologists to find out why this or that flood boundary is wrong. I just have to read the competing creationist hypotheses,
yeah.
and their criticisms of each other are valid on these questions. Okay, then, what does that tell us? Right? We either need a much more robust young Earth model, or there isn't one.
Yeah.
And like where I come down, it's
So
pretty
those are
obvious.
really, I
Pretty
think
obvious.
those are really the two significant issues facing young Earth creationism. That those are the two things that they continue to talk about, and they're driving a wedge between themselves because ICR has really taken some very different positions. I think part of it's a little bit strategic. They're kind of setting themselves apart because they need to have some distinguishing characteristic. I think they truly believe they're right about some of these things. I don't know where it leads because they are going to drift farther apart and it becomes harder to coordinate and harder to be on the same page the more you disagree and write about how the other side's wrong. And I expect more infighting in the future. It's just inevitable.
So that leads me to
Um,
two things. One is directly related to that I want your opinion on because you mentioned ICR being a little bit idiosyncratic. One of the things they do is, unlike most of the other organizations, AIG obviously allows natural selection to play a role in their speciation models. CMI has basically gone all in on like natural selection. Like, they basically define evolution separate from natural selection.
right.
They've had pieces of like, is the coronavirus evolving? No, it's just experiencing natural selection and changing allele frequency. It's like, well, gentlemen, that's what that word means. But they
Yeah.
just kind of ignore that. They just kind of say natural selection, of course, that's nothing. That doesn't count. But ICR is completely different. They basically argue that natural selection isn't a valid mechanism, and they have this other thing, this CET, this constant environmental tracking.
Yeah.
And this is for everyone. We don't need to go into the weeds of like what this is. It's basically an
No.
organism's respond to their environment kind of thing. Basically, it was debunked like legitimately 80 years ago in a very famous experiment. It's not worth getting into here. But what I love your opinion on is, one of the things that I see with this is, with organizations like AIG basically accepting a lot of evolution essentially in their models. And you've written about like this, the new evolutionists being like this kind of hyper evolution model to make this post flood world work. Is ICR setting themselves up strategically to be able to say, we're the real creationists? These other guys, they accept way too much evolution. They're selling out.
Yeah. I think that's exactly what's happening. I think ICR recognizes that, or they believe, I think they really do believe that these other groups have gone too far down the slippery slope.
Mhm.
Because Jake Hebert at ICR wrote an article about young Earth evolutionists, and he's directly talking
Yeah.
about other creationists who have swallowed too much evolution. And I think they're putting the brakes on that. And if you think about where they're putting the flood boundary way up high, they're pretty much saying that not many species have formed after
Right.
the flood. So they are going to limit the amount of species. They're going to say species can still,
They can
you
they
can
can
make
adapt to
species,
their environment using CET.
but you can only go so far in this program tracking thing because it all has to have been in the organism already, because you
Right, has
can't
to be front
actually
loaded.
develop any new characteristics. So there's only so far you can track the environment before you run out
Mhm.
of exploratory genetic space to deal with it. And so yes, I think that they are saying we're gonna be the survivors of all this, because eventually people are going to turn and they're going to realize, and you can't go back. It's kind of like once you slide down, right? You can't
Yeah.
backpedal. because you're gonna like, oh yeah, all these things we told you are true aren't true anymore. So it's kind of ironic that Answers in Genesis might be slipping into some form of heresy,
They're doing what
and
Ken Ham warned against theologically, but they're doing it scientifically.
Yeah. Now I think Answers in Genesis has some, I called it sort of divine genetic boundaries. They're gonna find some boundary that can't be gone across. So it's gonna make it sound like we know where the limits are.
I hope they.
But what happened was Kurt Wise and others suggested that maybe even there was a walking animal on the ark that got off and possibly
whales
evolved into whales. Now, I mean, he was speculating. He wasn't like, I believe this. It was more like, I think it's possible. But just saying it's possible,
opening that door is very risky.
And that has gotten a bunch of young Earth creationists really, I think, worried. And that I happen to know that I know personally that is something that specific thing is something that ICR is particularly pushing him back against. And so I think they're gonna say at some point they'll come out like, we're the true believers, right?
Which is
we have the best science, and we held firm when these other organizations
evolution
break
light.
apart. Yeah.
That's such an interesting.
That's a while down the road. I think that's a long-term planning there. I think that's like the 10-year plan, the 20-year plan.
Gotta have a plan.
But I also want to point out that ICR is run by an engineer too. So I think that's important for people to know, because the tracking thing is very much an engineering principle sort of concept. And so naturally you've got engineers there. Well, actually Henry Morris himself was a hydrologist. He's really a hydrologist. He was not a geologist. He was an engineer. Salem hypothesis, everybody look it up. Salem hypothesis. It's once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's everywhere. So related to this topic of the different organizations and the tension between them, we have to talk about, is Genesis history? This documentary from, what was the year? 2017. It was 2017. Yeah. So can you give us like a quick, what in the world is Genesis? Because this was like the super group of creationists. This was the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young one album, right? Like, what is Genesis history? Well, I don't fully understand the nascent collection of how it exactly came to be, but it is the product of something outside of the three major Young Earth Creationist ministries, which are the powerhouses where the money is. This is a separate group. There's a director, producer, writer who did the whole thing, and he's kind of an unknown name to most everybody. But he employed Dale Tackett to be the narrator, and he's sort of well known as a narrator and a biblical apologist, sort of respected in some circles. And he's also a quiet, soft-spoken, sounds very, very reasonable. He's easy to listen to. He's like the anti-Ken Ham, who's a little shrill and is very Bible thumpy, right? This guy sounds like he's weighing the evidence and he's thinking through things. Of course, it's a script he's reading, but nonetheless, he's projecting this very, open, like, let's look, is Genesis history? Let's weigh the evidence. And then we bring all these experts in. And the film is a documentary which kind of goes through and takes all these different experts in different areas. But what's interesting about it is the experts they bring in are not like, hey, let's just go to Answers in Genesis because they're the experts, right? They didn't do that. They have I think there's two people from Creation Ministries International. There is somebody there are two people from Answers in Genesis, but they don't play prominent roles. And then you have a bunch of other people that are on the periphery. They're like Young Earth creationists that work as independent agents. They're just independent scholars that are kind of known, or they have positions at colleges, and they're more academic. And they bring those in, and I think it's explicitly done to say we're not just Answers in Genesis, because they do have if we want to reach a broader audience, because I think that was their goal. Let's reach a broader audience because we're going to put it in the movie. We're going to put it in a movie theater, right? Right. This was not
something that you would, get the catalog with DVDs and like get them
No,
from, this was designed to be a general, not just young earth creationist thing. People
I
who
went to
don't follow this were supposed to see it.
I went to see it. I sat next to a guy who was a Catholic, didn't know what Young Earth Creationism was, really had never heard of it, but he always had questions about Genesis. And even in the Catholic Church, they there's questions about evolution and so forth. And he just thought it sounded like an interesting movie. He just showed up, and we got to talking afterwards. And I was explaining to him because he was like, this wasn't what I expected." But he was really intrigued. He was really, this is really interesting. I never thought about that. I never knew about this evidence. We got talking. I gave him my email, and we've had a couple subsequent chats about it. I gave him some different perspectives, to think about. But okay, back to the movie, right? So this is intentionally trying to say we don't want to just be preaching answers in Genesis. We're going to represent the young earth creationist community, and we're going to do it in a different style. This isn't going to be if you don't believe this, you're going to have all these wrong beliefs about all these other issues, and you need to, it's going to be very much just, let's stick to this one question, and let's sound incredibly reasonable about it. And because some of the people that are on that program really are fairly reasonable, Todd Wood and others, they have their convictions, but they also can be much more congenial and actually acknowledge that's a good point. I don't have an answer to that. And the movie doesn't come across as being like, boom, you're just like, this is the answer.
Can we just pause for a second, because relevant to this is a few years back, Todd Wood wrote what has become a very famous piece, Evolution, Not a Theory in Crisis, which then got a follow-up that he wrote. That was a reference to Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. And I forget who wrote that initially, but that was like one of the major texts of the creationist movement. And so Todd Wood, a dedicated young earth creationist, saying, hey, and I forget his specialty, but he is not just a random person. He has scientific credentials. So when he comments on this, it carries more weight than just some random person saying it. And this became a whole big thing of, he wrote this look, there's reasonable evidence for this, that, and the other thing. I think he specifically mentioned human evolution, which was, people did not like that. And
he didn't make a lot of friends with that one.
Right. And it was, the response among the young earth community to that was really interesting, because if your goal is to be taken seriously as a scientific hypothesis, then that is the kind of mindset you need to be in, of, we have competing theories and there needs to be a weighing of the evidence here, right? And that approach informs is Genesis history, but it's not at all what you get if you go to the websites for AIG, CMI, maybe ICR a little, because they're much more scientific, actually scientific oriented. But it's funny because the people involved in is Genesis history, some of them, like Todd Wood, very much do embody that approach, but then others absolutely do not, when they're not involved with his Genesis history. And it's a really interesting kind of comparison.
The movie definitely does have a meld of people with different competing interests and ideas, but the overall approach is more toward what I've been calling the new creationist, which is that perspective. It's sort of, we have questions, we have convictions, we know that the Bible must be true, that it has to be young. We don't understand fully how that works, but we are exploring that and trying to figure that out. And they're honest about that. Now, and then they're willing to look at it and say, I understand why you might go out there and look, and it looks like it's old, right? There's evidence that is just in your face that kind of reeks of ancientness, and we're not going to deny that. Whereas Ken Ham and others, they're going to say all the evidence points to a young Earth.
Right.
And it's not even if you look at it right, it's almost as if it should point it to, even if you didn't know what the Bible was, you should just walk outside and go, oh, the world is young. And that's a very significant difference in approach among creationists. 'Cause that's a different, that's a different apologetic. It's a whole different tact. And that's why Andrews and Jensen and others, they get really upset when you even admit anything that it's like, well, this looks that way. No, it doesn't actually look that way. Like all the evidence points to a young Earth. And if it doesn't, it's only because you've misinterpreted that evidence. Ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what Todd Wood and others are going to say too. We're misinterpreting it, but he'll at least admit that it's understandable why it looks that way. And I don't think you're crazy for thinking that. You're not just denying. You're not like, I don't believe in God, so therefore I'm going to make myself look at it this way. No, it's like, it really does look that way.
You can do things. Need to find like radiometric dating is real, and you have to like account for that in some way if you're gonna hypothesize that it's not actually billions of years old. You have to like figure that out, right? There's energy, there's isotopes. You have to figure out how they got the way they are. There needs to be a mechanism. There needs to be a model there, and that Ken Ham approach of like it is literally everything, which is, as you've pointed out, is becoming increasingly ironic with this like very rapid speciation model of post-arc diversification through a bunch of mechanisms that are fanciful, let's say, that do not reflect how population genetics work in any realistic sense. So we've been going for about a little over an hour. So what I want to do, if it's okay with you,
5 minutes.
I know, we're just sitting here just talking about creationism and time flies by. So what I want to get into is, I think that's a great kind of place to kind of wrap up the how are they in conflict with each other. But one other thing I want to touch on that you've pointed out that really interests me is how these different organizations are either handling or ignoring non-creation science issues, and who's getting involved with the culture war and who's just kind of like, you know what, we're just not going to touch that. And you see this all over the place. Obviously, AIG has a very big kind of just evangelical culture war footprint right now. One thing that surprised me a ton in the last year is that turns out the Discovery Institute is full of like anti-vax COVID denying whack jobs, which is not something I expected, but that turned out to be the case. So what's going on with like AIG? I mean, you've talked about it a bit earlier that Ken Ham was really the science second and the culture first. So it kind of makes sense for AIG. So what's kind of the interplay there, just with the broader culture war, and take as much time as you need. You know, it's only 10 o'clock. So I mean, if you want to go 11, 12, just, you know, just expound upon that not at all complex question.
Yeah. Let's see. How should we begin? Well, we've been talking about ICR kind of focused on science, thinking of themselves as a research. I mean, they call themselves a research organization, and they're really interested in scientific questions. And I'll say that the people there probably really are interested in science. I mean, they do have an interest in science. Now, as they're also believe in that they're understanding the science so that they can win hearts, you know, for Christ. And so they are going to produce literature and so forth, but they're very much focused on some of the scientific questions and saying we're providing answers to questions about how to interpret world history within the context of this work. But they're going to touch on some things. But boy, this is really hard. How about this? How about we look at the approach that they have towards, say, coronavirus,
right,
as a starting point.
Which is, so one of the things that I've talked about here, and some people might have been here for this, is I've looked at CMI being very aggressively pro-vaccine, to their credit. Rob Carter, Jonathan Sarfati, like to the point of picking fights with people in YouTube video comment threads.
They've been going after it.
One of the least dignified things you can do with your life is fight with people in YouTube comment threads. And I say that as someone who is guilty of it.
No,
but like, you've got
over here.
well, you've got they put out videos saying it's safe, it's effective, it's good science, get vaccinated, we need to do blah 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 blah, and they frame it as, God has given us this gift and we can use our brains and figure things out and we can solve this problem with science, so we need to do it.
Yeah.
And the comment threads are just full of conspiracies, and it's really a trip if you go and read through. And I read through a couple of threads that were like hundreds of comments deep, and it was, man, that audience did not want to hear
I
that message.
would say in a sense they kind of, I'm really appreciative of what they've done too.
Yeah.
And I've told them that multiple times, but I think that in a way they've reaped what they have sown for a while in terms of their type of, they're hearing some of the exact same arguments they make about other issues, and it's just being turned around upon them. Although I will say that a lot of times what they're hearing is the type of arguments that Answers in Genesis is maybe a little bit more prone to making, or maybe what some of the other fringe creationists that are on YouTube and other areas that are a little bit like more outspoken, they are very much influencing the conversation. And so maybe I can tangent off on applying to the same question, but what's happening to Answers in Genesis and other organizations is what they're finding is they're influencers, right? They have they put out material. They can influence a lot of things. What's happening now is their influence has created an environment of expectation of certain types of arguments and certain expectations for where you're going to stand on certain issues. And then when they don't actually, when leadership of Young Earth Creationist organizations find themselves wanting to teach their audience, you need to, we're experts, we're going to train you, teach you, they come back with, that's not what we expect you to believe. And it's kind of the flip situation where they're trying to influence churches by being grassroots and then having the congregation ask the pastor these hard questions. Now you have Young Earth Creationist organizations who, all the fringe creationists who have wilder ideas are pushing those back into Young Earth Creationist environment, and they're having to defend themselves. And they're realizing, wow, we've created a bunch of wacky, crazy arguments that are just using our style of rhetoric and our style of logic, and like flat Earth and other topics like that. And it's hard for them to defend, because when they defend it or when they argue against it, I can go in and use their argument and say, well, yeah, but that's actually true for all those other things you believe too, right? It's hard for them to escape it, because it's like this circular thing.
I saw a beautiful microcosm of the thing you just described. It was on some random Young Earth Creationist YouTube channel, which I spend way too much time watching random Creationist YouTube channels, because this is what I do in my free time. I said, what are people saying? What are the big organizations saying? What are the random YouTube channels saying? And I caught this conversation where it was somebody was in this chat with 8 or 10 people. And one of the participants was basically saying that natural selection isn't real. They weren't making the Fodor, you can't make a causative connection argument. They were saying natural selection does not exist. It's not a real thing that exists in the world. And they were arguing that no, all the dog breeds are not related by common descent. That is not a real thing. They are all completely separate. And so you had a number of Young Earth Creationists that were pushing back against this person. And if you listen to the arguments they were making, they were sounding like me when I talked to them. And it was like, the arguments you're making are true, just follow them further, and it works for humans and other primates, or all of mammals, right? It's the same sets of arguments work at the different scales. You're applying them to try to convince this one random person that no, actually all the dog breeds do share a common ancestor. But the exact same logic works for, as you go up in scale. And it's 100% the thing you just described, where you have this pushing of the boundaries with these organizations, and the audience comes to expect a certain set of arguments. And then within the broader culture, it spills over into other realms. So it's well, you should distrust what the scientists are telling you about evolution. but that phrase stops at, you should distrust what the scientists are telling you.
Yeah.
But the vaccines are good. Well, it's like, well, you told me I should distrust them, so why should I trust them now? And it's, you can't unring that bell once you've convinced your audience.
Well, we were talking earlier behind the scenes about a book that just came out with, how to go into college and survive, right, in a secular college as a Christian. And what Ken Ham has done and harped and beat on his audience is that everyone else is out there is out there attacking you and every one of your views. And so what happens is he's created distrust in any kind of thing outside of the enclave.
Yeah.
And then that spills over into, all right, don't trust seminaries, don't trust, it really becomes anti-intellectual. Don't trust anyone who's really says they've thought about this issue. It's like and studied it. And so that's, but then eventually at times you want to say trust this person, but now you've created distrust. Yeah. I mean, we could, this fits a lot of other political situations too.
Yeah.
But
it's so true, because like AIG, just in the last couple of weeks, you see this melding of all these topics into just one kind of identity, right? Where you have to check all these boxes. You can't just take the Young Earth box, but then take the pro-vaccine box and this and that. You have to, it's all one thing. Yeah. Just in the last couple of weeks, AIG on their homepage has had anti-critical race theory article, at least one. They had an anti-trans article within the last couple of weeks, basically saying like, will women ever win a sports competition again if men came? And it's like, why? Are you kidding me? Like, why are you doing that? Why do you have to do the anti-trans thing on your homepage?
All of those things are just cultural calling cards.
Exactly.
That show your identity. And see, because your audience. I mean, he knows his audience has a distrust of those particular topics. I don't want to get into those topics, but if he's saying that, look, you can identify with me. So therefore you can trust all these other things I'm going to tell you because I am in your tribe. That's just showing you're part of the tribe. And that's how others identify each other. You say certain keyword, I mean, what do politicians do? They just spout out, I'm against this, I'm against, they don't know what it is. And it kind of doesn't matter, right? Because all they're doing is signaling to the people who have the same feeling, it's all right, you can trust me on this, and therefore trust me on other issues as well. And that just is the hot topic of the day. But Ken Ham is very good at picking up those types of key words and using them to his advantage. You remember the moral majority from the 70s, 80s? In a way, I see Ken Ham as kind of becoming that sort of leader. He's become more political over time. And as I think I said in one of my recent videos, there is a sense in which, I said it in the review of creationism. One thing that creationists are going to be challenged with is the more they identify politically, it narrows their base. Much as politics, certain bases are being narrowed because there's only a certain number of true believers, and it becomes harder for them to communicate with the people that are on the fringe, that are maybe not like way out there, because for them it's like you're all this or you're nothing, and therefore the ones that are all in are a smaller number. And I think that's going to be a problem for the continuation of the Ark Encounter and some other parts of their organizations, because they are limiting their audience because they're not truly trying to reach out, because by identifying and continuing to harp on some of these other issues, they're just narrowing their clientele. That's a big problem.
And that goes back to what you mentioned a couple minutes ago, where you have this positive feedback loop of escalating kind of fringe positions that slowly migrate, or really it's that the center of gravity in the group migrates closer to that fringe, which in turn alienates people on the other side of the spectrum, and it migrates a little bit further, and it migrates a little bit further, and you end up with this positive feedback loop of increasing kind of purity tests, which is an interesting contradiction with the very public-facing, the inoffensive Ark Park. Just go and see the, just go and see the, go. They have a zoo. They have a zoo for kids. Go and see the zoo. Take your kids to the zoo. It's great, right? It's an interesting contradiction there, where on the one side you have these these, increasingly extreme positions as like what you need to adhere to kind of feel at home here. Whereas on the other side, it's just tons of money being spent on these public facing kind of essentially tourist destinations
It
that
is very much
can be
like
treated separately.
it is very much like, hey, everybody come. We advertise nationally, but who does come? It's still a pretty select group. It's,
Mhm.
it's whittled down to those who really want to come. Although I will point out that where the grassroots part of this, they have pastors' conferences. Then the pastors will go back to their congregation and they'll give them some free tickets or something like that, and they recommend they go. And so they make a youth group trip. And so you're bringing a whole bunch of people, and maybe that's where you invite your neighbors and friends. Hey, we're
Mhm.
going to go see the Ark.
It's true. It'll be
and
fun. It'll be a
and
fun trip.
and so while you're there, you see some signs, you may learn a few things that you might start asking you questions. And so it does have that kind of outreach aspect to it. But it's still really for the true believers. That's the core that's going to
Yeah.
sustain it.
So it is. We have been going for over 80 minutes now. I don't want to take up your whole night. So I have one more question for you, and we could do this. We can keep this short and try to keep it to like 90
You're
minutes.
talking to somebody who lectures for an hour and 15 minutes, like,
Oh,
and
oh,
thinks it's 5 minutes. So
talking.
careful.
Oh, I'm talking as somebody who does the
Yes.
same. Don't worry.
Yeah.
Oh, don't worry. So, and in the summer I have double periods. So, don't worry.
Wow.
Don't tempt me. Don't threaten me with a good time. So, you track this stuff literally on a daily basis and you put out content week to week. Like, what is everyone doing and what is everyone talking about? So, where is this going? We've got these conflicts within the movement. We have scientific organizations. We have some that are much more culturally oriented. We have lots of disagreement in terms of how much evolution we actually have to accept. Just in the last few years with AIG, I think it's AIG, just huge increase in donations to them. But at the same time, their relevance in the scientific community, despite like some of their big names like Nathaniel Jeanson putting out books, the relevance to the scientific community is essentially zero.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So like, where's this going? What are we looking at in 5 years with these organizations? Just tell us the future. Let me know.
Yeah. Yeah. My students ask me that all the time about the Omicron. It's like, boy, there's no telling the future there. But I think there's some things we can say about the future of Young Earth Creationism. First, I would point out that Is Genesis History, which we talked about, is sort of this other. It's actually an organization now. They have a website, they have a blog, they put out videos. It's very well done. I think they're building. And one thing we're going to see is Answers in Genesis. All large organizations have a life cycle, right?
A shelf life.
And their shelf life is going to very much be determined on the health of Ken Ham, because he's such a strong figurehead. So they're faced with a transition time sometime in the next 10 years. That will shake up, I think, the landscape. And I think what you have is, we already talked about ICR, right? They're kind of positioning themselves to possibly sort of come back into a more prominent position. And I think you have Is Genesis History over here. They've kind of collected the periphery, like academics outside,
Picking
who are
up all the
kind of
free
misfits,
agents.
right? They're the kind that they don't want to work at it, or like in an organization under one person. They like the academic environment. They're working at Christian colleges. They want to dabble in things, and they're kind of freer too, to kind of like be more academically free. Then clearly, if your Answers in Genesis, you have very limited ability to sort of speak out on topics or really let yourself, daydream. And so I'm getting off on tangent. So back to Is Genesis History. They're coming out with another movie that they're filming right now, and it's going to be called Mountains After the Flood or something. It's Paul Purifoy's vision of what did the world look like when Adam and Eve, when Noah stepped off the ark, right? And he's scanning the world, which has been destroyed. And what did that environment look like? And obviously he's going to have to deal with, like, how do the animals get from where they are to where they eventually will be? How are they going to diversify? How did the mountains actually form? Because there's many volcanoes, there's many different geological and geographical features of the Earth, which they don't think the flood directly made. So now we talked about how some of there's differences between ICR and AIG. Do you see how there's going to be some really hard choices they're going to have to be made? Because I don't think they're going to just, I think they will kind of say there are different views, but I think they're going to pick a view.
They're going to have to, they're going to have to pick a flood boundary. They can't not pick, right? They have to. I
think that they will. I think, well, Snelling is going to be a significant figure in the film, and he is Mr. Early Flood boundary.
It's going to, well, yeah, I mean, it's going to be.
So it's going to be an anti-ICR film, I think.
Right.
And the most important thing to remember is, I think it'll have influence. I think they'll put it back into the theater, and I think that millions of people have seen that original movie, or they have videos of it, and it's an influence that is outside of Answers in Genesis, wheelhouse. So whatever they say is going to seep into the consciousness of Young Earth Creationism, and other organizations are going to have to deal with it. So this is their chance to really make a mark. That's why I'm very interested to see who's going to be in it, because I will know right away when I find out who's in it, what their message is going to be.
Yeah.
If it's Todd Wood, Wise, the group that's with them now, which I think they really like, it's going to have a particular flavor, and it's going to be a different view than the other main organizations. That's going to create more rifts, I think. It's going to create some dialogue of some sort. I don't know if it'll be pleasant dialogue or not, but they've got some things to sort out. Now, overall, I know people want the Ark Encounter to fail, the Creation Museum to become covered with spider webs, but it's going to succeed because how I don't know what the word I want to use here is. The particular fundamentalistic form of Christianity that is the thing that is the mover and shaker behind all this isn't going away anytime soon.
Right. There's a built-in audience, especially regionally. It's
But you can see that Ken Ham and others are worried. I mean, they have a huge hit piece out on Biologos today.
Yeah.
And that's a big move, right? Because Biologos has made, and that also shows the influence. They used to try to ignore other groups. Now they have to confront them because they see their influence seeping into churches.
We could talk for another hour and a half just on like Biologos and kind of the Francis Collins approach and like that. Oh, man, that's a whole other thing.
So the interplay of these things is eating away. Not only have they restricted themselves by becoming more associated with particular political viewpoints that then shrink their audience even more because they take positions that are very narrow, and I think needlessly narrow in many cases. That shrinks their audience, and then you have other groups that are kind of filling the void with people that I call them truly, Christians that are out there that don't just like automatically soak in whatever they're told, and they have questions, legit questions, and they are pondering things. People are really exploring, and they really want to know. I mean, those type of people that come to my blog and other places, and they're reading and they're trying to sort things out. Those groups that provide people an opportunity to explore without just being, here's what you need to believe, they're gaining some traction. I mean, there's always an audience that just wants to be told what to believe. And that'll always exist. But there is a good slice of the pie that's sort of out there for other organizations and other groups to have influence upon. So I think Young Earth Creationism is not going to die, right? It'll exist 100 years from now, 200 years from now. But I think it's had its heyday. Its heyday was in the early 2000s. It's not going to become more influential. It's not going to be in all the schools, despite what it might sound like, that if certain parties take over, all of a sudden we're going to be teaching Young Earth Creationism. No, I think even they have given up on that dream.
It seems like it. All right. So I just want to say, just selfishly, I really hope what ends up becoming the dominant view, which kind of already is, but it's the KPG boundary, the earlier flood boundary, because the genetics and the evolutionary dynamics of the post-flood speciation is just, it's so bonkers. I love it so much. It's just every time I read something about it, just like, What? I love everything I read about that, just because you have to get really creative with your mechanisms of like, how
Yeah.
does population genetics work when you're doing that? And it's really fun to just dive into that stuff.
But don't you
So,
have to admit that reading creationist literature leads you to like understand other
oh,
concepts even better? I mean,
100%.
I've learned so much by being challenged by, that idea sounds like it has some merit, and then having to work through the intricacies of how it actually works.
Yeah.
And that's the way I
I've
learn. And it's I wouldn't know nearly. I would be apt to just like, oh, this is the way, this is what happens because I was
I
told that. I've had to learn it myself in order to explain it.
I'm an evolutionary biologist because I had a class in college that I thought was going to be a philosophy class, and it turned into a pro ID propaganda class, and I got very mad. And so I learned a lot of evolution that semester specifically to argue with the professor for that class. And I like it was like I was interested in it, and I was already into bio and genetics, but the thing that like got me into evolution specifically was somebody force feeding me intelligent design and having to like, let's check on that very
Well,
carefully
we
in
go
a
all the
lot of
way back to the
detail.
beginning. I said that when I
Like,
was handed
here we are.
Morrison, Whitcomb and
Yeah.
Morris's book, and I read it, then all of a sudden I had a lot of interest in figuring out.
Yeah.
I can't just say you're wrong. I need to say
You
why,
got to figure out
right? I
why.
mean,
We're going to,
I don't just tell people, well, this is totally bogus. Here, let's explore this. Let's think about it. Yeah.
so that brings us to about 90 minutes. So I think that is a great place to end. So before we wrap up, I want to, again, I just want to point everyone down below. There's a couple links in the description. You've got Dr. Duff's YouTube channel, which everyone that's here should subscribe to. You also have the blog if you're more into the writing and the long form stuff in there. Some great stuff there that's really fun to read. I can't recommend all of that enough. The other thing, stuff just to be on the lookout for. We just talked a bit about the follow-up to Is Genesis History? We don't have a release date on that, do we? It's sometime in the next couple of
Well,
years, but we don't know when
yeah.
exactly.
Originally, it was supposed to be this spring, and now they're saying this fall. I won't be
Okay.
surprised
Oh,
if it
okay.
gets
This
pushed
fall,
back.
that'd be great.
Yeah. I mean, they've filmed a large portion of it, and
Okay,
it's
cool.
editing. I really think that it's the script is going to be hard to write. I
Yeah.
just don't know how they're going to decide.
So then the other big thing that's coming up in this world is Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, who every young Earth creationist will tell you he went to Harvard. So he knows what he's talking about. Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson has another book coming out. It's called Traced. It's about human evolution and how it proves young Earth. It doesn't. I know all of his human evolution arguments. They're all wrong, but I can't wait to read this book. And
And
I
what
don't
did
want,
he
I saw
study at Harvard? What did he do at Harvard?
cell developmental biology. Yeah, but all his writing is about like evolutionary genetics, and it shows that he did not study it because it hurts. It hurts. So I don't want to. I saw a question in the chat about reviewing that book. I don't want to speak for Dr. Duff, but I am 100% getting that book, and I am going to just dive into it with both feet. I can't wait to read that book. I'm so excited. It's
I can't wait to watch your videos.
If it's anything like replacing Darwin, there's going to be so much to talk about. It's going to take hours, and I can't wait. So I'm really excited for that. So let me see. Dr. Duff, do you have anything specific or interesting that you have coming up? I know you got the weekly. I've told everyone the weekly This Week in Creationism series. You should 100% just watch that every week. It's a delight. Anything specific you have on the horizon?
I'll just bet. I mean, the next video is probably going to be a Young Earth, the fossils say no, and it's kind of a trip through my own childhood backyard in Colorado. Just like, here's what I see, and very personal story.
Very cool. And then
I
have that will be. I'm looking forward to that. And then I have a couple things coming up. I have a conversation with Rebecca. It's Bread of Life and Examining Evolution. I have a conversation with her coming up in a few days, which I will. I'll put the link on Twitter and here, and you'll see it around. It's on. Let me get the date on that for everyone. I'm prepared. I'm good at this. Let me get the date on that for everyone so I can here. That is on
TBD.
Let's see. It is Friday, the 4th of February at 9 p.m. It's going to be on the Examining Evolution channel with Rebecca. we're gonna talk about. She's got questions, and I'm gonna try to answer them because why not? That'll be fun. So that's what's going on, everybody. I want to thank you all for hanging out. I see 35 people here, but only 31 likes. So someone's dropping the ball over there, or maybe you didn't like it. You should hit dislike instead. That's fine too. Subscribe to me. Subscribe to Dr. Joel Duff, who has been my guest tonight, and I hope you all enjoyed that. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you very much.